Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Wednesday. Today we're going to look to James chapter 1, where he tells us how to overcome temptation. And one of the things that James writes about our temptations that we face, he says in James chapter 1 and verse 12, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to them that love him. And let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil. Neither tempteth he any man, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed." The first thing that James wants to tell us here is that we are not tempted by God. After all, he is a holy God and he has nothing to do with evil. He certainly would not place evil in our paths. He wants us to succeed. So we recognize that God is not the tempter here. We know, of course, who the tempter is. It is Satan. But how does he do that? He uses our own lust. The Bible says here we are drawn away and enticed by our own lusts. That's where we have to realize how important it is that we get away from that, or that we avoid those kind of things. You know, I think we all know down deep inside where our greatest weaknesses are. The kind of things that we are the most liable to succumb to in our lives. For Joseph, he fled from Potiphar's wife, left his cloak behind. For Timothy, Paul wrote to young Timothy, flee youthful lusts. What do we need to do in order to overcome those things in our lives? Because he said it actually comes from within. Whenever we are drawn away by our own lusts and enticed, that picture of being drawn away means that we're being allured or charmed or persuaded or maybe even beguiled by our own lusts. But you know, the most dangerous thing about this is not the fact that we are tempted or the fact that our lusts draw us into certain things. It's what happens whenever we surrender to those things or whenever we succumb to temptation. He writes on in the last verse of that passage, and he says, "Then when lust has conceived, it brings forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, it brings forth death." If we do not run or flee from those greatest lusts in our lives, then they conceive and they draw us to sin. And sin will eventually lead us away from God. And when that happens, we're in big trouble. Giving in to that temptation or that sin will ultimately lead us to death. So today, let's recognize our weaknesses. Let's recognize where sin and lust and temptation come from within, from our own thoughts or our own weaknesses, and let's flee those things. Let's run. Let's make sure that we surrender only to God in our lives, not to our own lusts. And then he says, we will receive that crown of life.